Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros, and tonight we are going to learn about the Magnus Carlsen Variation in the Sicilian. Something I never thought I'm going to say, but here we are. So let's take a look at the basic position where Magnus Carlsen came up with an invention. So let's dive on in. E4, C5, Knight C3, D6, D4. Already sort of a strange move. You wouldn't expect this. You would expect something more like Knight F3, Knight F6, D4, takes, and then we would get the typical Najdorf structures. Now, instead, white goes D4 immediately. But this does need a little bit of a background. So this game, the STEM game, is from 2018 between Magnus Carlsen versus Wojtaszek from Poland. Both of them are grandmasters, very well-known players. Of course, Magnus is a world champion. Now, what actually is very interesting that this event where they played was held in Shamkir, Azerbaijan, in honor of Vugar Gashimov. And interestingly enough, if you just put this into any of the databases and take a look who played this, it was Gashimov who played this system. C takes d4, queen takes d4, knight c6, and he played bishop b5 with the idea of transposing into Budapest type of structures, sometimes even kind of thinking about playing an early f4, as the knight does not really have to go to f3, but this transposes back to well-known waters. And this has been played multiple times with good success by Vugar Gashimov. And if you're not familiar with it, Vugar Gashimov's legacy is a very, very strong Azeri player and was top 10 at some moment, but sadly he passed on early due to bad health and problems. But in this game, in honor of Vugar Gashimov, whom Carlsen faced himself multiple times and knew how good he was, he came up with an original idea, which of course makes this the Magnus Carlsen Variation. And that move is Queen D2. But here I do want to take a little detour talking about naming openings and who can name what. There is no rule, actually, in chess who can name what and what are the guidelines. There are plenty of lines played by Alekhine that is named after the hotel he played at. And in fact, Alekhine, there is an anecdote that he was very upset of the fact that that sanatorium got the credits and not the player playing it. So, interestingly enough, there are these ideas and ways of naming, and I did read the comments a bit before of the Smith-Morra line I showed earlier, and I do have to mention, just because you do not have an internationally well-known title doesn't mean you can't invent openings, and for that example I have to give you the sailor named Captain Evans, who was an inventor and a sailor mostly, but we all know him for inventing the Evans Gambit. Was he titled? No. Was he a world champion? Not even close. Yet he managed to play one fantastic game, and we have that gambit to us all. But back to the game. So Queen D2 looks like a strange move, and I completely agree with the chat. What is this Queen D2 move? Makes no sense. Why is it played? So, well, for that, you've got to understand, most of the times in these positions, you would get dragons, and 99.999% of the time, you could not go b3, bishop b2, because the knight being loose on c3 and potentially attacked by the queen with queen a5 ideas. So that kind of begged the question, can white play dragon style and sort of create a fianchetto on the queen side? And I'd assume that was one of the ways how Carlsen and his seconds came up with this idea of going queen d2 and b3. I mean, queen d2, b3, and bishop b2, that he'd love to go there and play that direction, having a dragon kind of pressure all along this diagonal. Is the idea of b3, bishop d2, bishop b2 new? Not at all, but the whole concept of losing quote-unquote time with the queen go to d2 and leave the knight on g1 is completely original, and it is by all means Magnus Carlsen's invention, never been played before this game between Carlsen and Wojtaszek. So queen d2, knight f6. The games that we're going to look at will mostly focus on knight f6, but there are other ways of playing with g6, bishop g7, sometimes even bishop h6, but that won't be the topic of our discussion. So queen d2, knight f6, the most natural way of playing b3. And here Wojtaszek goes for the classical Scheveningen structure, which I guess in some ways is a mistake by black because it doesn't really take advantage of white losing time. White is losing a lot of time with moving the queen from d4 to d2 and making two moves just to develop this bishop on the long diagonal. However, once Carlsen manages to organize his pieces, he is a little bit better than usual. The bishop on c1 actually has a comfortable spot, and the king will be relatively safe on the queen side, tucked away, and then white's plan is crystal clear. You can't really say the same thing with black's position. In fact, e5 would be an interesting choice as well, and in fact, let's play it in this game between Fedoseev and Nair. Nair is very well known for being the coach of the women's team of the Russians women's team, and Fedoseev is of course an upcoming young prodigy from Moscow, or at least now residing in Moscow. But our topic is e6 here, bishop b2. And this is actually not that great because it does not kind of close off this bishop, and that bishop will become a monster, as we shall see. a6, long castles, b5, f3. And in fact, if you just look at the database, you'd see the who's who, whoever played this opening. Mostly the names you would see are high-ranked and are super talents. Namely, Aravind played this with white against Shashi Kiran, who was Anand's second, and he went for g4, b4, knight a4, castles, g5, knight d7, h4, and you can see how blindingly easy it is to play this position. You just throw all those pawns at your opponent's king, while it is much more difficult to go against white's queen side, as there is this knight blocking off any potential a5, a4 moves, with this bishop on b2 kind of consolidating the king's situation. So, not liking that, and facing this whole variation the first time, Wojtaszek decides to go h5. Not something unusual and not at all something that we haven't seen before. This is one of the patented move of the Najdorf, and even some other lines kind of flirt with this idea. This is played in the Taimanov too. The point is, black is trying to take away the g4 square, and that kind of hinders white's attack. White can't really go f4 just yet, because that would run into b4, and then the e4 pawn would fall. Now, in e4 openings, if you lose the e pawn, you better have very good compensation, otherwise in deep trouble. So this is the first moment. I'm actually curious if you guys can catch the difference between a normal Sicilian and the Magnus Carlsen Sicilian. And probably this is what caught Wojtaszek unawares. He didn't expect this maneuver to show up on the board. So if you are watching live, or if you're watching later, it is your time to shine. Try to find Magnus Carlsen's quite outstanding maneuver. So just a little bit of a hint. Usually you would have a knight on d4, And in that case, you have like a limited amount of maneuvering that you can do. However, here, the knight is not on d4, and it gives some extra options for Magnus. Exquisite is saying the knight is on g1, that's the main difference. That's a good starting point, but just noticing your pieces will not make you successful. You still have to find the way, and you still have to find a target in your opponent's camp. So first things first, you will have to go and check out where you can latch onto those targets. Not many in black's position. There is, of course, the traditional d6 weakness in the Sicilian, but it is surprisingly hard to come close to that one. So the d6 pawn is actually hard to capture. Bishop a3 would run into b4, and that's something everyone wants to avoid, including me. And Astapada finds the right plan, and indeed it is knight h3, with the idea of getting the knight to g5. Normally this is not even on the agenda, because you have a knight on d4, and there's no option doing this. However, here Magnus has this extra option, and with the pawn already on h5, this maneuver makes a lot of sense. You will not be able to drive that knight away, and the weakest link on f7 is going to be crucial. Knight h3, bishop e7, knight g5. And these are very, very difficult cases when you're facing someone very well prepared with a brand new opening. They know what they're doing while you're sort of trying to figure it out the first time in your life of what's going on. And someone's asking whether f6 will be an option. Not really, because apart from this d6 pawn, this e6 pawn needs some defenses. If you ever play f6, this will be just way too weak, and let's redden that square, because that's going to be a big issue in that scenario. So Wojtaszek plays h4, which in some ways I do not understand. I understand that he's trying to gain some space, but this move by itself doesn't really do anything positive for black's position. Probably something like bishop b7 would be better, at least trying to get some development going. Not that if white plays h4, it would make worse for white, but definitely wouldn't change a whole lot in any case. So he goes h4, a little bit more ambitious, trying to kind of stop white from playing g3 or g4. But I don't think that Magnus really wanted to do that. In fact, with this maneuver, the e-pawn is defended. I know it's a little bit unorthodox way of defending the e-pawn. However, it works. And if it works, it just does work. And he goes f4. Changes plans. He doesn't even go for g4 anymore, because that's the whole idea of his opponent. Wojtaszek is trying to play against that, but with this switch, he's actually gaining time. Not only does he have pressure over the f7 pawn, but he's getting ready to go for some f4, e5 breaks. Bishop b7, and here you can see that h4 was basically a waste of time. King b1, typical Sicilian move. You just make sure the king chills on the b file so it doesn't run into some tricky play with that rook c8, pressing on that knight on c3 and c2. Rook c8 was played, so king b1 actually is justified. And again, as we're sort of learning the Magnus Carlsen variation, where would you put the f1 bishop? That is probably the first thing you would want to know. Not many options, but two options are still plenty when you have to make one good decision. Let's see bishop e2 considered. What about bishop d3? I mean, bishop e2, of course, is an idea, but what about getting the bishop to d3? Both is actually legitimate, but one of them is a bit more logical than the other. So I see e2 will hit the g4 square. Well, for at the moment, that is kind of controlled. So I don't think that's going to be a big issue. Bishop e2 doesn't block the d file. That possibly could be a reason. If you want to break with e5, the e2 blocks the e file. Not sure that the bishop, if it goes to e2, is the final destination. I saw in the chat, and I agree, this bishop probably wants to show up on f3, sort of neutralizing that bishop. Now, I think both moves are playable, but Magnus went for bishop e2, probably with the idea of getting the bishop to f3, pressing against that bishop, and sometimes e5 gains strength. If you go bishop d3, you are actually not neutralizing that monster of a bishop over there. Queen c7, rook e1. Not even in a rush to decide of going bishop f3. Knight h7, knight takes h7, rook takes h7. And Wojtaszek, to his credit, he's fighting and he says, hey, I still would like to do a couple of exchanges if I can, because in that scenario, definitely he will get very, very good play, and with more exchanges, the easier it is to sort of defend. Now, in this position, Magnus does the Magnus thing. He goes for something that is for surefire good, which might strike us who love sacrifices as a bit jading, because we hope for some drama on the chessboard. However, you don't always have to be dramatic. He went for g4 here, which is completely fine, and he is just better in this position. He has no need to really complicate matters. But it does turn out that he could go the typical knight d5 sacrifice way, as this king is still stuck in the center. Black is bound to get destroyed. Takes, you have to take, otherwise you lose the pawn, or at least the bishop, with big play on that king, f5, and it definitely is going to collapse on black. So knight d5, e takes, knight b8, and as shocking as it may seem, after bishop d3, the simple move, black is just completely lost, because if you go here, white can just take this pawn, here, bishop f6, and there's absolutely no way of stopping the simple threat of rook takes e7, and bishop takes e7 winning the queen. And that kind of shows that even if super grandmasters see these ideas, or maybe they missed it, I'm not 100% sure, but sometimes they would go for the more cautious way if they feel that they're already in the driver's seat. And probably he felt that he has a great position, why risk the advantage when the most natural move leads to a slightly pleasant position for white. Now this is not necessarily the way we think, who are not super grandmasters. We would love to do and play the more sparkling move, but they are playing for the title of a super tournament. So for them, there is this added risk. If they misplay the position, it might be very costly. So in this sense, I don't think g4 can really be condemned, because he's really just saying, hey, I'm better, I have no reason to play risky chess. H takes, bishop f6, bishop d3. Now as black already showed his hands, he makes sure everything's defended and goes for the simple g4, g5 plan. And this is actually kind of the beauty of the Magnus Carlsen variation. He's not really trying to do anything special. He just wants to go all in with the attack on the king side and tuck the king away on the queen side with king c1, king b1. Very simple play, a bit cavemanish in some respect. You just go full on for the attack. Rook h8, g4, immediately going for g5. Knight d4, and this is actually the first question, what to do here. It seems like white has some issues. But Magnus is not just good at attacking, he's pretty good at defending. So let's channel our inner Magnus Carlsen and try to find the best defensive move right here. Now, of course, with that, we first have to notice what Wojtaszek is setting up with this move, knight d4. What could be the potential issues that we're facing? Well, for one thing, the c file is opening up, and that means this knight on c3 is a little bit loose. So if we could stabilize that, that would be wonderful for our hopes to win this game. Now, you might be asking me, did Magnus see this move prior for him playing g4? And my answer is, I think so. And the other threat is knight f3. So there's two threats lingering. One of them is this one, and the other one is this knight f3 fork. So the only task left is to stop both. There could be some tactical sacrifices on b3 as well, with bishop takes c3 on tap. So I've seen some suggestions going rook f1 or rook e3. The question is, which one sort of eyes the threats more? Clearly, we've got to make sure that that c3 knight is defended. If it's not defended, I'd be worried about knight takes b3 sacrifices. Yep, that is correct. Rook e3, both eyeing the f3 square and that c3 knight, which makes knight takes b3 unplayable. Because if takes here, queen takes c3, there is this bishop b5 check, and the queen will drop on the c3 square. Compare this to moving the rook to f1. There's knight takes, a takes, and bishop takes c3, and there's no way of refuting it in this case. When in the other one, with rook e3, this rook is ready to do a discovered check on the queen. So these are those little subtle ideas that make and break a position. And of course, Magnus Carlsen wouldn't be Magnus Carlsen if he wouldn't find this. Now again, rook e3 not only stabilizes the position, but it also stabilizes his advantage. Now he can go back to his old ways of just throwing those g5 and f5 pawns. The Magnus variation, yes it is, and it is straight from 2018. And this is in the Sicilian. So king f8, just trying to sidestep that trick. And here again, a Magnus Carlsen-esque move. He is not afraid of exchanging pieces if that consolidates the advantage. Knight takes c2, rook takes c2, bishop c3, takes. And instead, really, of going for the endgame, he still realizes that there's a difference between this king on b1 and on this square on f8. And the huge difference is that our king is safe on b1, and that king on f8 is in some danger. So for Magnus to exchange right now, that's not something you should be doing. So he goes queen e3. Keeps the queens on the board and continues on with the hopes of running those pawns down. So you might be wondering, why was he doing these exchanges? He just didn't want to sort of waste his time thinking of defensive moves, and once he clarified all these threats on the queen side, he's moving on to attack mode on the king side. Rook c5. But with rook c5, black actually makes quite a weakness in black's position. What could be wrong with this move, Rook C5? I mean, it has a purpose, don't get me wrong. It does take away and cover all those important squares. However, Rook C5 has a downside. What could that downside be? The back rank issues, exactly. So before with the rook on c8, it was sort of guarding all these back ranks. But with that rook moving over to c5, that isn't really the case anymore. So that really begs the question, how could we get closer to black's back rank? Well, if we go f5, we do try to open up the position, but I don't see the back rank really opening up with this move. We really don't have any pieces on the f-file yet, so that's not likely to work out. Now, of course, f5, g5 is something we discussed, but I think Magnus noticed that, oh, you change your plans, well, I might change the plans of my own as well. Definitely you could try rook e1, rook h1, but it's a little bit too long, and the king might actually get a chance to run away and run towards the hills, running for their lives. However, we don't want to give that luxury. So Magnus did the immediate e5 with his rook on d1, sort of eyeing that d8 square. This makes a lot of sense. Now, this is still a sharp position. It feels kind of chill for white because there's nothing going on the queen side. However, if we dilly-dally a bit too much, we might run into some issues. Now, black can't play d5. Not only would make this bishop French, which means it'll get very passive, but it also gives this f5 idea, and then we can just come on in there and it's just gonna be a brutal checkmate on d8. Not to mention that this solid structure will give a free hand for white to just double up on the f-file. So he took on e5, which probably made Carlsen quite happy. F takes e5, rook h1, sort of playing against these rook d8 ideas. Takes, takes. And this is the moment we need to take control. How can white take a final control of the position? It's not that the French defense is bad, it's just not good. So yeah, let's try to find here Magnus Carlsen's very nice idea. So one of the ways of looking for moves is to keep in mind which one of your pieces is actually part of the game. The bishop has a job, and its job is to defend the c2 pawn, so there's nothing funny happening over there. Is the queen involved in the game? I would say so. The queen puts pressure, can even go queen g5 later on. But there is a third piece that really isn't contributing a whole lot, and chess is basically a group work. Therefore, rook h2 was played by Carlsen, and with this rook infiltrating through the h-file, attacking that h1 bishop, black is completely losing. Because if you go here, white can just go check, go queen g5 with a decisive attack. So here instead, Wojtaszek is trying to muddy waters, but it's too late for muddy waters. Check. And here, black resigned, realizing there is no way out. Of course, Magnus isn't going to blunder mate in 1. If you go king f6, white can give a queen f2 check, just to make sure everything's safe. After rook takes h1, it is game over, because white is up a healthy extra piece and there's no hope. So after queen a7 check, Carlsen won due to black's resigning. So this was actually the first game ever played with the variation, the Magnus Carlsen game versus the Wojtaszek, and this is the Carlsen variation. So guess who got inspired to play this opening? None other than Hikaru Nakamura. So we're going to take a look at his game versus MVL. Let's see how he treats this position. So in this game, knight f6, e6, the same thing happened, and Hikaru as white will face a different type of challenge. Remember, in the previous game, or what we usually call the stem game, Magnus faced a6 and b5, but sort of MVL is a bit sharper, or feels that white is losing just too much time, so he may as well try to complicate matters with d5. But d5 actually has one downfall with it, that it creates a potential target on d5. That is the dreaded isolated pawn, which has a bad reputation, but it's not actually that crystal clear if it's bad. So he takes d5, he takes d5, long castles. And this is different though than your usual isolated pawn positions. This king on c1 can run into some danger after some potential queen a5 and bishop a3, as it actually is going to be featured in this game. The only issue that black is facing, that while black has the center control, white already has castled. So MVL will have to be treading very carefully not to run into troubles immediately. So he goes bishop e6, just bolstering the d5 pawn, king b1, queen a5. Now, as all of you are a bit new to the Magnus Carlsen variation, or some of you necessarily are, how could MVL's idea being countered? How can we counter this idea of bishop a3? If actually MVL could get bishop a3 in there, castle, his position wouldn't be as bad at all. Might be even better, as there is like a ready-made attack over at the queen side. The question is, how did Hikaru Nakamura stop this plan? There are a couple of ways of doing so, but it is always worth taking some time checking the options. So yes, indeed, knight b5 is the move played by Hikaru. The point is, not only he's stopping this idea of bishop a3, but pressing that queen on a5. The best part of this position is that now, after the exchange, white gets the most pleasant of the endgames that you can possibly get. There is a constant weakness on d5, not much play against white's pieces. The only issue white can be facing is that the bishop, the knight, and the rook on h1 is still stuck in the first rank. But Hikaru will make sure that's not a problem. Knight e4, typical MVL move. He still complicates things just to stay afloat. Rook e2, quite a calm move. He is making sure that's defended, and eventually he's going to kick out the knight. In fact, the very next move he does takes that knight out. So we get this typical isolated pawn structure, and I wonder, what would be the ideal setup for us? Chat, viewers, any thoughts on what would be an ideal formation against an isolated pawn? It's actually very important if you get these type of positions. Should you try to attack it, or should you try to block it? Well, yeah, definitely, if we could get both of the knights or one of the knights to d4, blocking is one way of sort of pressing down the opponent. It's not that you're necessarily going to win that pawn immediately, but in the long run, it is going to hold back black from getting good counterplay. So blockading an isolated pawn is much stronger than attacking it, because oftentimes that just takes too much energy from your position. So a6, knight d4. And this is the other thing, and the pleasant thing when you're facing an isolated pawn structure. Any exchange you do, you actually benefit from that, because in the long run, this will be a target. It might not be a target right now, but it's going to be a target later on. Definitely, the knight maneuver of knight h3, knight f4 can come to play, but not quite yet. Knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop c5. Takes. Now, if you would go knight h3 here, that would be ill-advised. You would create a doubled pawn in your structure with your pieces still kind of lingering on f1 and h1. So Hikaru's next move is a positional extraordinaire. So let's try to find it. It is very close to the plans you guys already mentioned, and it is more of like strategic in nature. Can you spot Hikaru's next move? So what will be the long-term plan for Hikaru? If you can find that, then you can actually kind of put the jigsaw puzzle together. Well, it'd be amazing if we could sacrifice in this position, but sadly we just don't have enough material to do so. Well, our pieces are still scattered. They're too passive, and this rook is just in the way. So Hikaru decides to move that rook to d2. Whole idea is he wants to get to d4, and if that knight can sit in there, he's going to have a stable advantage. And not to forget about that, it also kind of moves out of the way that bishop, which is very important. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get the rook out. Rook e8, knight e2. That's where the knight is headed. Bishop f5, king b2. So he doesn't go knight d4 immediately, because black could win some time and sort of it would tie down this bishop on f1. So he decides to go king b2, circumventing this in-betweener, and he's planning to go knight d4 just a move later. Knight e6, and you can just see that both of these players understand and see the opponent's concept. So therefore, they're kind of playing against each other's plans. Now, if knight d4 would happen now, takes, rook e1, and even though there's a d-pawn weakness, it doesn't really mean that white is better, because the rook on h1 is just stuck. So here Hikaru changes tack and goes for a kingside expansion. And that is actually like the typical Super Grandmaster play. You're not just focusing on one single plan. If they're kind of trying to neutralize that one plan you had, you're looking for another one, so you can distract them with that. g4, bishop g6, h4, and he is starting to push MVL back a little bit, trying to play against that bishop on g6. h6, bishop g2. May not be the best move, but it does develop and gets that kind of loner rook on h1 into the game, which is crucial in endgames to get a full involvement, if possible. Now, at this moment, it seems to me that MVL got a little bit desperate, although it's somewhat understandable. If white manages to go something like king c7, rook d1, and f4, this can get very annoying very quickly, as white has this annoying idea of expanding with f4, f5, and there are some direct threats against the d5 square. So here MVL does the typical French defense, not like the French defense as the opening, but he is going to muddy waters before it gets too hot. Rook d1, d3. C takes d3, and he makes sure that, yes, he gives up the pawn, but for that, he'll get some pressure on that pawn with the pieces sort of smothered, because black has a little bit more space right now. Knight d4, knight takes d4, rook takes d4, and this is kind of the part of the game that kind of differentiates again between super GMs and not so super GMs. Super GMs know how to win these positions even when it seems difficult to win. Now, should this be winning for him? For sure this should be winning. But it depends of how you go about it. That d pawn is a weakness, but it's also a strength. That's the reason why it is sort of up and ahead. It's an extra pawn, and that should be making white's life easier. So he goes king c3. And that is the typical grandmaster, that is super grandmaster move. He over-defends his pieces and then looks around if he can devise a plan. Rook d8, h5, bishop h7, bishop f1. Not a fan of bishop f1, but probably Hikaru wasn't a fan either. He just found no other ways of improving this bishop. Black still has some play because this d pawn is far from actually turning into a lady anytime soon. But an extra pawn is an extra pawn. Rook f4, bishop e2, and probably here MVL makes a mistake. He goes too aggressive when maybe just sitting and waiting would have been better. Why sitting and waiting would be better? Because it's still not yet clear what Hikaru is attempting to do in this position. You can't really break through yet on the king side, and that would be something for Hikaru to answer. But when he plays f5, that is MVL, he gives like a clear sign that he's not afraid of creating targets on that side of the board. And of course, Hikaru immediately brings his rook over, pressing down the g file and eyeing that g7 pawn weakness. Rook d7, g5. Exchanging some pawns and also keep this bishop locked in. And from a position where it seemed very technically difficult for Hikaru, he's actually gaining momentum. And this is actually the part where you kind of realize chess is more of a sport than science towards these critical phases. Here, Nakamura just outsmarted MVL and sort of turned MVL's style against him, as he should have had possibly sat and waited for Hikaru to show his hands. So f5 was probably a bit early, and now this g5 move is kind of strong. Rook h4, takes, d4. And this is those moments when you realize that, hey, you can take that pawn. That's not going to be important. What's going to be important is your bishop being buried by that f5 pawn. Rook h5, bishop c4, and this bishop, from being the sad person on g2, becoming the strongest man on the board. King c7, rook dg2, and look how tables turned. From active positions that those rooks and bishop had with pressing that d pawn, suddenly it's white who has the active pieces and a potential passer d pawn. f4, bishop e6, taking away all those active opportunities and still kind of pressing that bishop down. Rook e7, rook g7. And guess what? The reason that Hikaru is dominating is because of that bishop over there. King d6, Rook takes, takes, bishop c8, setting up a double threat of bishop b7 and rook g7 check. Bishop f5, takes, takes, check, king f6, rook takes b7. So this is how he actually played MVL. He made sure that everything was under control, waited for the right moment to turn it around, and he got the active pieces. Now, here black still has some hope of survival, but it's already kind of close to losing. So let's see what happened. h5, king c4. Again, a very important move by Hikaru. He is planning to support that d pawn, which is actually not that simple to do with this h5 pawn, because the king won't be able to carry the h pawn. This f pawn is right there, taking away that square. So king g6, d5, h4, d6. That d pawn is making a run for it. h3, rook e7. Now, when you're new to endgames, oftentimes you panic and you feel that you must waste time stopping it. But the more you do this, the better it gets, really. If the king is not supporting that passed pawn, after h2, it can get to rook e1, and it stops that pawn from promoting. So this is just that typical race. You want to run down your pawn, but you don't really want to waste time defending or going rook b8 and rook h8. So rook e7, rook f8. Now again, Hikaru does what has to be done in the endgame. He involves the king. King d5, rook h8, rook e1. He's not afraid. He knows that the pawn won't promote by itself. There is that king that needs to be involved in order to actually pose a threat of winning the c1 rook. King g5, d7, and MVL is trying, but is just too distant from getting there. Also, not to mention, there is this rook e8 idea. Now, sometimes we do miss these like little moves. They're very, very important. If you can cut off your opponent's rook from controlling that square, you should. And then there is this promotion. Sometimes I see even grandmasters miss these kind of in-betweener moves. And that kind of wins the game. Of course, MVL is much too strong to fall for that one. Goes rook d8, king c6, king h4, and rook e8 wins. Now this wouldn't necessarily win if there wasn't some extra pawns for Hikaru, but there is. And after this one, white can safely sacrifice this rook for the h-pawn, while Hikaru's king is gonna pick up the rest. And that is it for the Magnus Carlsen variation, and I really hope you enjoyed and you have a fun time playing it. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day or night, wherever you are. Bye-bye.